Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Restoring Hope with Crosswinds Counseling. I'm your host, Curtis Smith. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And as always, a huge thanks to our community partners, Prime 47 Downtown, Shepherd Community Center, and Tesco. Without the support of these amazing organizations, we would not be able to be with you every Thursday night at 9:30 right here on WHMB TV 40. Well, as always, we have a great show for you tonight. Our first guest is a man with a resume almost too long to read. So I'll start with the one I want to thank him for the most. Military veteran Robert Vane is with us tonight. So Robert, thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I appreciate that.
You are a veteran of the Army. What was that experience like for you?
Well, the first 8 weeks were pretty hateful. Then after that, it gets a lot better. And basic training is something that you can't describe almost unless you've experienced it, because it's such a change from how your life is led beforehand, and it's a change that happens in a day. We got to Fort Knox at like 2 or 3 in the morning, and we immediately started getting screamed at, and we were all like, we just got here. We couldn't have messed up that badly.
Right.
We just literally got off the bus. So that's one of those things where in your mind, you're wondering if you made the right decision. But in 4 generations of my family, there are 15 veterans.
Wow.
So, I kind of had a general idea. And then my son, later on, his name's Joshua, he ended up doing 2 tours in Afghanistan. And so it's just something that tends to run in families. My mother was the first female Marine Corps recruit in Indianapolis after World War II.
Is that right?
And it never left her.
Wow. So it was in your blood.
Yeah, both my parents were in the Marines.
Why did you do the Army instead of the Marines then?
Well, if you ask my parents, it's because I'm a sissy and a coward. But however, the actual answer is because I graduated from high school in 1986, from Howe High School out there in Irvington on the east side. And I wanted to go immediately into the military, but the timing of it is backdated. So when your school, what's called Advanced Individual Training, AIT, when they're able to accept you based on the MOS you've been granted or selected, they take that, then they go, that takes this long, then basic training. For the Marine Corps, I would have had to wait almost a full year, and I just didn't want to wait that long. I knew I was already going to be behind my peers in terms of college attainment and how many years into that. So, waiting a full year wasn't really something I wanted to do. The Army recruiter says you can get this job, and my AIT actually was at Fort Ben Harrison.
Wow.
15 minutes from where I grew up, so that was an added incentive.
So after those first 8 weeks, which don't sound real fun,
No.
things got a lot better?
Yeah, you get more freedom. Of course, I was coming back to Indianapolis. I got out of basic training just in time to watch the IU UNLV Final Four game where IU wins, I think 97, 93, and then goes on to win the national championship a couple days later.
Yeah.
And so I actually got to watch television. That was the first thing I got to watch. But basic training is all about stripping away your civilian mindset and then fostering a dedication to something bigger than you and create a sense of a brotherhood in arms, which is certainly true. And that never leaves.
You were in the Army for 3 years. Have any of those 15 family members been lifelong military service folks? And why was that not the calling for you, do you think?
That's a great question. Nobody was. My son Joshua would have been career military, but his back got injured so badly his second tour in Afghanistan, he had to get out because he just couldn't do what the Army required. But nobody in my immediate family. Some of them were drafted.
Yeah.
Like my Uncle George Murray, who drove what's called a Higgins boat. So if you see the boats at the beginning of Saving Private Ryan, that's basically what you're looking at. So he drove those in 8 major landings in the Pacific.
Wow.
Including Okinawa. And so he's drafted for service. So there's a lot of that. And then, I would never say that we were poor. I would say that we were, because I associate poor with being hungry. We were never hungry growing up, even though I'm sure that whatever the world record is for eating SpaghettiOs, I'm right there somewhere in the top. It was a chance for me to pay for college. I had no chance to go to college if it wasn't for the military. And so, I'm very grateful, and I wish that more people would give of themselves either in military service or Peace Corps or something to their country, because our country gives us so much.
With that in mind, you give back to military veterans. How do you do that?
Well, I try to get them as much publicity as possible for what they're doing for free. So I don't charge veterans when I do their public relations. As a matter of fact, just this week, I sent out a news release on behalf of a friend of mine who is working with military spouses in the sense of entrepreneurship. And she wanted to pay me, and I told her no. I said, buy me lunch. She's like, no, I want to pay you. And I said, I don't charge veterans because I charge if it's a campaign, right? If it's like 6 months. But if they're like, hey, can you help me? Then I think that's part of it. A lot of these veteran businesses, especially when they're smaller like mine, money's tight or the margin's very small. So if I can use the contacts that I've accumulated over my years in this business for free, then I want to do that.
Do a lot of those military veterans assimilate back into life well? Do they get into the business world and succeed, or do you find that it's a real struggle for them?
It can be a struggle. Everyone's different. I know Vietnam vets who think about it every day, and I know Vietnam vets who tell me, I haven't thought about that, I'm not like handicapped by it, for lack of a better term, or have that PTSD. But a lot of it's the experience. I never experienced combat, thank God, but my son spent almost 3 years in Afghanistan. So what he's going to recollect is just going to simply be different. There are a lot of services out there. One of my favorite is the Veterans Court that's run by Judge David Serto. It was terrific. He received a Jefferson Award from WRTV Channel 6, who does all he can to set veterans straight who have come through the judicial system for things they've done. And a lot of folks are just looking for guidance. One thing about the military is if you want to be a knucklehead in the military, you have to work at it. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's probably not going to go well for you, right?
Well, the thing is, there's so many people to keep you in line, and there's so many rules and regulations that if you want to be an outlier, then you're going to have to put effort into it. In the civilian world, we simply just don't have, a platoon leader, a squad leader, a company leader, those sorts of things to always kind of go, Vane, what are you doing here?
Yeah.
And people struggle because they don't have those guardrails.
We're going to continue our conversation with Robert Vane in just a moment. Robert, thank you for spending a little extra time with us.
Thank you.
We'll continue the conversation and hear about his podcast when we come back in just a moment. Welcome back to Restoring Hope with Crosswinds Counseling. I'm Curtis Smith. We're spending a few extra minutes with Robert Vane tonight. Robert, thank you for carving out some time for us.
Thank you, sir.
You are the host of a podcast called Leaders and Legends. You're 174 episodes in. It's a weekly podcast for the last three and a half years. For those who haven't heard it yet, tell us about Leaders and Legends.
Well, thank you for mentioning it. When I left Mayor Ballard's office in 2010, I was his Deputy Chief of Staff and Communications Director. So I started a veteran-owned business called Veteran Strategies, does public relations and so on and so forth. And I was looking for a way to market my company to keep it kind of in the public eye, make it a little more prominent, that sort of thing. So a friend of mine named Rachel Coverdale, who's brilliant, said, you should start a podcast. And I kind of chuckled and said, well, I'm not a true PR pro in the sense that I'm trained in that from college. And said that, as I mentioned to you before the show started, my graduate degree is in medieval history, 14th century England. And I just kind of laughed. I'm like, I don't think there's a big market for that podcast. And she said, probably not.
Right. I asked you what you do with a medieval history degree, and you said,
starve.
Yeah, right. That doesn't translate into a lot of jobs.
It doesn't, and frankly, I got lucky. I got hired at the Indiana Republican Party in 2006 by the wonderful Jennifer Hollowell, and then Greg Ballard shocked the world in 2007 when he beat Bart Peterson. He's in the Marine, spent 23 years in the Marine Corps, so I knew him a little bit. We would chat about the military stuff, and I got a chance to work for him, and he's the best man ever. And so, except for P.E. McAllister. They're tied. They're 1 and 1A. So anyway, I said if I was going to do a podcast, I would want to do something that used kind of my Rolodex, the people I've met in politics and government and that sort of thing. And I'd want to make it an interview show and call it Leaders and Legends. And she goes, no one's doing that. You should do that. And I've been fantastically lucky in who has come on, both from an Indiana/Hoosier perspective, but also I've had a lot of authors and historians appear on the podcast. And, you know, those are somewhat special to me because that's what I love to do is read history. But, you know, I've had Eric Holcomb and Mitch Daniels, and I've done commemorative ones on Frank O'Bannon, Joe Kernan, Evan Baez come on, Dan Coates, Susan Brooks, Jim Morris, Mark Miles, Allison Millangton. I mean, just a whole host. Chris Jensen has come on, with whom I used to work at the Indiana Republican Party, who's now the mayor of Noblesville.
Yeah, he was on our show not all that long ago.
Yeah, terrific.
Yeah.
Judge Sarah Evans Barker, the list goes on and on. But I've also had some very interesting, Gene Cady, in case there's a Purdue fan watching or listening, even though I am not. I've had some terrific historical figures and authors on. Probably the two people who I would say that were the most, I was most in awe of whom I interviewed. One is Medal of Honor recipient Sammy Davis. I don't know if you've had him on your show, but you could do a whole evening on Sammy Davis's exploits. Most people don't know he is the model for Forrest Gump. Matter of fact, in the movie, when you see Lyndon Johnson place the Medal of Honor around Tom Hanks's neck, that's actually Sammy Davis's body, and they just put Hanks's face on it.
Wow.
But he's terrific to talk to. He's met all these presidents. The story of what he did to earn the medal is so ridiculous. You just simply can't believe that this man is still alive. And the fact that he rescued someone, put him on the helicopter, the guy was pronounced dead, but Davis could sense that he was alive, and 40 years later, Sammy Davis held that man's grandchildren.
Wow.
Because he saved his life. Second person I would say that was very popular podcast who I just simply couldn't believe I was talking to is someone by the name of Clint Hill. Does that name ring a bell at all?
I don't think it does.
Clint Hill is the Secret Service agent who climbed aboard John F. Kennedy's limousine after the shots rang out in Dallas. So if you look up pictures of that day, you'll see a Secret Service man on the trunk.
Right.
So Jackie Kennedy's, remember, she's climbing out of it, and the man who climbs on it is Clint Hill. And he's written 2 or 3 books about his career, but he came on to talk about his career a little bit, but mostly that day.
Sure.
And I just, you just can't believe that you get a chance to talk to someone like that. So it's very rewarding for me as a historian, as someone who enjoys asking questions, much like you do.
Yeah, I really do.
So it's a fun hobby.
Yeah, that's great. Because it's called Leaders and Legends, I want to ask you, is there a theme about being a great leader or leadership in general that you've picked up that's kind of run through the podcast?
I tell my PR clients this, to be candid, and that is all effective leadership and all successful messaging has a singular foundation, and that's credibility. If you don't have any credibility, then you're not going to be able to get people to pay attention to you. Your words aren't going to last. In 1961, Dwight Eisenhower gave a speech about the military-industrial complex. The reason that speech has resonated is because his entire life was in the military. He was a 5-star general.
Right.
If Adlai Stevenson had given that speech, right? No offense, Governor Stevenson, it just wouldn't have had that sort of resonance because of the difference in their 2 careers. So, credibility is absolutely crucial. Another example is Nixon to China. When he went to China in '72, he says, I can do this because I've spent my entire career fighting communism, and I think this is the right thing to do. If, for example, McGovern had tried it, if he had won in '72, if he had tried it in '73, you're talking about, even though McGovern was a war hero, a bomber pilot, you're just talking about a different sort of attitude towards that person. So if you have the credibility, another example, Mitch Daniels wanting to make Indiana a more business-friendly state.
Yeah.
So those sorts of things, that's what runs through a little bit of boldness, some credibility, and a willingness to take a chance.
Yeah. Real quick, Robert, tell us where we can find the podcast.
Apple, Spotify. It's actually hosted on Wish TV on
Okay.
their All Indiana Podcast Network. Would love for people to take a listen. We have historians, government officials, nonprofit, sports figures, and we have a fun time. As I say, I build my podcast as something that is informative, entertaining, and comfortable.
Awesome. Leaders and Legends with Robert Vane. Robert, thank you so much for spending time with us tonight.
You're very kind.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. Each week here on Restoring Hope, we bring you our Beacon of Hope segment to make sure we stay focused on that most important word in our title, hope. Tonight, Crosswinds executive Abe Hepler is back to share with us how God brings order out of chaos. He's going to help us find that truth tonight.
Hi, I'm Abe Hepler. In the beginning of the scriptures, at the very beginning of the Bible, we find the story of God creating the universe. And in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, we find these words. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was without form and empty. Darkness was on the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now this word deep was a really interesting word in the Hebrew language that this poem was written in. The word deep is actually the Hebrew word chaos. At the beginning of the Bible, at the beginning of all things, we find God sitting present in the middle of chaos. But God doesn't leave the universe there. In fact, over the rest of Genesis chapter 1, we watch as God brings order to the chaos he was living in. God literally creates order in the universe. Now, I think this is incredibly important for us. I think it's an important idea for us to understand because if your life is anything like mine, you may have places that feel chaotic. Maybe it's a mess on the kitchen counter. Maybe it's your bedroom closet. Maybe it's the chaos that's being created for us emotionally by our relationships. But we are to imitate God. We're to do what God did, and God steps into chaos and creates order. Tucked into this ancient Jewish religious poem, we find that we as people have a God-given responsibility to bring order to the places we find chaos. And the reason this is so important is because as we create order, hope gets born. As we step into the places in our lives that have chaos, that are chaotic, as we fix those things, we discover hope.
Welcome back to Restoring Hope with Crosswinds Counseling. In this week's Counseling Corner segment, Kyla Neely is going to discuss a topic that we can probably all use a little help with, setting healthy boundaries.
Hi, my name is Kyla Neely, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker with Crosswinds Counseling. Today, I'd like to talk to you about boundaries. I'll define what boundaries are, give some maybe examples of when it's appropriate to set boundaries, and then also give some examples of what those boundaries can look like. So the definition of boundaries is essentially just rules we set with ourselves on how we're going to interact with people. Dr. Henry Cloud, who's a clinical psychologist, and he wrote a book about boundaries, defines boundaries by property lines. So he says that if you can imagine a property line, it helps us identify who's in control, what choices that person has to make, and who's responsible for those choices. And so keeping that in mind, we can use boundaries in relationships to make those same definitions. So what does that mean? If you are feeling maybe anxious or disappointed, you get fixated on certain topics, these are all signs or symptoms that it might be appropriate to set a boundary. We can set boundaries with ourselves, we can set boundaries in relationships, and we can also set boundaries in the work environment in order to avoid things like burnout. Some examples of that would be a boundary with yourself could simply just be, I'm going to be kind to myself. I'm not going to use negative self-talk. So instead of saying things like I'm worthless, I'm selfish, I hate my body, we could use kind words that just, say, I will be nice to myself or I will be kind to myself. A boundary in the work environment, if you notice yourself getting anxious or frustrated every time an employee sends you an email or every time you get an email, you could simply just respond to that email by saying, hey, I'd like to talk about this in person, in order to help yourself kind of decrease that frustration and again, give you some of that control. A boundary in relationships, oftentimes we can go to friends, spouses, partners to vent, and sometimes they start giving us advice, and that's not what we need in that moment. That causes more frustration, that causes more anxiety for us. So simply by just saying, hey, I just need you to listen in this moment. I don't need your advice. That's a boundary to set. Boundaries, ultimately, they just give us that inner peace. They help us feel safe and comfortable in social situations, or safe and comfortable within ourselves. If this is something you're interested in exploring more, feel free to contact me at Crosswinds Counseling.
Thanks, Kyla. A good reminder tonight on how we can be healthy with the boundaries we set. Well, you just met one of our wonderful counselors. Maybe you need to schedule a visit with one of them. But maybe you are a counselor or a therapist and you're looking for the right place to use your skill and compassion. Crosswinds Counseling is hiring. We need great women and men to join the organization and help us provide for so many people in need. If you're interested, you can go to crosswindscounseling.org/careers. We have opportunities in Indianapolis and Fort Wayne, and soon Dayton, Ohio. Check out crosswindscounseling.org/careers to see all of the openings. Well, as we wrap up tonight, a lot of thank yous. First to you for joining us. Also a big thanks to our sponsors, Shepherd Community Center, Prime 47 Downtown, and Tesco. And of course to our friends here at WHMB TV 40. We'll see you next Thursday night at 9:30. Have a wonderful week. Stay safe and be blessed.